The first settlers of Australia, the Aboriginals, came to the country about 51,000 years ago. In the late 1700s, London became overcrowded and the crime rate rose. The British needed a place to send their prisoners, and when the prisons became full, they turned to Australia, and the country was officially colonized by Britain in 1788. After the World War II ended, a new migration program started, and since it commenced in 1945, 7 million people have immigrated to Australia. As a consequence of the immigration, today 1 out of 4 Australians is born overseas. The opinions about immigration are split in Australia. Some argues that as the driest inhabited country, they cannot survive the coming years with the same population growth. They fear that the country will face even more frequent droughts and extreme weather. The campaign group Population Matter believes that to be able to keep its population in the future, Australia should have 10 million inhabitants rather than the current 21 million. The immigrants also tend to demand a lower salary, and this is a challenge for the locals. It is especially a problem for the locals that doesn't have a higher education and whom applies for entry-level jobs. Despite these negative arguments, 52% of the Australian population stated in 2014 that they were in support of the current level of immigration or that they supported an increased level of immigration. With these numbers, it is not hard to believe that, and I quote, Australia is the most receptive to immigration among Western countries. As an article written by Andrew Marcus on Monash University in Australia says. In this presentation, I want to find out if there are things that indicate that this is not the most receptive country in reality. As this picture states, Australia may have a visa for you. If you do not have a valid visa, however, you will be sent to a detention center, where you are health and security checked, as a part of an assessment test that will confirm if you have a legitimate reason to stay in Australia or not. Australia is actually the only country in the world that carries the strict detention policy. The purpose of the detention center is to, and I quote, support the integrity of Australia's immigration program and management of Australian borders. In 2011 to 2012, Australia was the country that received the biggest amount of asylum seekers, but they were placed 22nd on a list showing how many refugees were accepted by per capita. According to Australia's Department of Immigration and Border Control, in December 2014, 49% of the people in detention center had stayed for a year to 1.5 years. The same report showed that the biggest part of the people in the immigration centers arrived illegally by boat. A big part, the yellow part of the picture, did also overstay their visa. It is the people arriving illegally by boat, the so-called boat people, that causes the biggest debate in Australia today. The refugees that arrive by boat are victims of human smuggling, and they are in danger of drowning or getting hurt as the standard of the boats are very poor. There has been different policies by the former prime ministers as how to get rid of this problem. The current government has a policy where they have military operations where they send back the Indonesian boats arriving on Australian territory. The different policies thus cause debate and discussion in Australia because some claim that the current policy is against UN's human rights for refugees. And the pictures that you now see is from the remainings of a boat that carried about 100 refugees, and it smashed into Christmas Island in December 2010, and on that day over 30 people died. And the islanders did stand on shore and were not able to help the refugees. And on that day, Australians had to face the fact that people are suffering in their country and to get into their country, even though many of them would like to ignore it. Now we're going to have a look on a news report made by Democracy Now! They are discussing a hunger strike that's been going on in a detention center. The detentioners are protesting against them having to move to another detention center at Manus Island.
A massive hunger strike is underway at what some are calling the Guantanamo Bay of the Pacific. The Manus Island Detention Centre is paid for by the Australian government and run by an Australian contractor, Transfield Services, but located offshore on Papua New Guinea's soil. The inmates are not accused of any crimes. They're asylum seekers from war-ravaged countries who are waiting indefinitely for their refugee status determinations. 80 detainees recently signed a letter to the Australian government saying, in part, quote, "Here, a disaster is about to happen. Please prevent this disaster." They're asking the United Nations to intervene against the Australian federal government's plan to resettle them in Papua New Guinea, where they say they could face persecution. Some have barricaded themselves behind the detention centre's high wire fences. Others have resorted to increasingly drastic measures, such as drinking washing detergent, swallowing razor blades, and even sewing their mouths shut to protest their confinement.
Jennifer Robinson, you're an international human rights attorney. What's the law here? You've been to PNG, you've been to this area.
I've been to PNG and I've spent times in West Papuan refugee settlement camps, so I can speak with first-hand experience that PNG is not a state that is capable of accepting our asylum seekers and refugees. 90% of these people who come by boat to Australia have been determined to be refugees in the past. The conditions in PNG are terrible. It is unlawful for Australia to be continuing to send asylum seekers to conditions the UN has found to amount to inhuman and degrading treatment. We are in breach of our international obligations. The problem is enforcement. Australia's domestic law, the High Court of Australia, has continually found that offshore detention is permitted under the terms of Australian law. When we had the Malaysian solution under the Gillard government, it was challenged before the High Court and found to be inappropriate because we had a provision in our law that you couldn't send asylum seekers to a country that didn't meet certain human rights standards. In response to that, the Australian government amended that to remove that from our domestic law, which means we are no longer constrained, and they upheld the constitutionality of offshore processing. This is a clear breach of our international obligations, but what we can do as a matter of law within Australia's courts is limited.
Andrew Marcus's article talks about Australians' attitudes towards immigration, but it's easy to see that the attitudes are not in accordance to the Australian immigration policy. The Australians say that they are in support of the current level of immigration or even an increased level of immigration. But the policy says that we should send back immigrants coming from, let's say, Indonesia to the country that they so desperately wanted to move away from. And one can question ourselves why the Australian democracy lets the politician that carries the detention policy win, and why they don't stand up and fight for the immigrants' rights. Of course, they do have arguments for not bringing in an unstoppable stream of immigrants as, for example, the ecological one, but Australia does not have any arguments for treating their asylum seekers, as the interview says, inhuman, unlawful, and not in accordance to the human rights of UN.